In the half-light of a frontier evening, a woman sits at a crude table with a single sheet of paper in front of her. A kerosene lamp hisses softly. The wind presses against the boards of the little house, looking for cracks. Somewhere outside, a dog barks once and falls silent. She reads the letter again, lips moving, as if saying the words will make the man who wrote them more real. She has never seen his face. He is out there, somewhere beyond the miles of prairie or sage or pine, waiting with the same mix of hope and dread, wondering if the woman who steps off the stagecoach will look anything like the small photograph he has tucked into his Bible. This is the world of the frontier bride, married by mail to a stranger she knows only through ink, paper, and promises. Long before anyone in the West talked about mail-order brides, American frontiers had been solving the same problem the same way. From the earliest British colonies, places that attracted a lot of men and very few women discovered that if they wanted families instead of lonely, restless bachelors, they had to bring women in on purpose. In the 1620s, the Virginia Company sent young women to Jamestown so the struggling colony's men would stop disappearing or marrying into native communities, and France later recruited the filles du roi for New France for much the same reason. 2 centuries later, when the American frontier pushed west across the Great Plains and into the Rockies and Pacific Northwest, the pattern repeated itself. Mining camps, logging camps, railroad towns, cattle outfits, almost all of them were overwhelmingly male. Modern research using 19th-century census data confirms what people at the time could see with their own eyes. Frontier counties had far more men than women compared to settled areas back east. That imbalance shaped everything. For men, it meant loneliness, drinking, brothels, and constant talk of going back east to find a wife that many never acted on. For women, it meant something else entirely. In a world where marriage was still one of the few accepted ways to gain social and economic security, the frontier almost guaranteed that a single woman would not stay single for long if she could reach it alive. But getting from an overcrowded boarding house in Boston or a farm in Ohio to a cabin in Colorado was not simple. Train tickets cost money, travel was dangerous, and even if a woman could get west under her own power, what would she do when she arrived? Knock on doors? So a new kind of business grew up in the spaces between railroad towns and eastern parlor rooms, the long-distance marriage market. Some of it was surprisingly modern. By the mid-1800s, newspapers across the United States carried matrimonial columns alongside their advertisements for plows, patent medicines, and sewing machines. Men and women who had never laid eyes on each other traded carefully worded notices and letters, seeking a spouse in places they would never visit themselves. Historians who have combed these papers describe columns full of bachelors on lonely farms, widows trying to rebuild their lives, and young women hoping to escape poverty or stifling small-town gossip by starting over somewhere no one knew them. A man might describe himself as a sober, industrious gentleman of 30 with land and means, seeking a respectable young lady of good character, object matrimony. A woman might answer that she was of moral habits, not uncomely, 22 years of age, willing to share a man's lot if he were steady and kind. From there, letters would begin to cross the continent. The pace was slow. Weeks could pass between replies. Postal delays, blizzards, washed-out bridges, and Indian wars could interrupt a budding courtship without warning. Yet thousands of such correspondences took shape anyway, each letter carrying more information, family backgrounds, religious beliefs, expectations, fears. The women who wrote them were not all dreamy romantics. Contemporary accounts and later scholarship show a wide range of motives. Many were single and saw no real prospects where they lived. Others were widows with children, knowing that a farmer or merchant in the West might accept them where a local man would not. Some were runaways or women looking to vanish from a bad situation and reinvent themselves under a new name. The men were just as varied. Homesteaders who wanted help holding onto a claim, storekeepers hoping marriage would make them look more respectable, miners and cowboys who had finally grown tired of eating alone. At some point, for a few of these couples, the letters moved from careful, guarded politeness to something more like intimacy. They traded small confidences, nightmares from the war, memories of lost siblings, the smell of lilacs in a childhood yard. And then, sooner or later, one letter would hold an offer. He might write something like, "If you still find me agreeable, I will send the ticket, and we shall marry upon your arrival." Sometimes the match was arranged less organically. In certain cases, men on one side of the country would quite literally pool their money and send an emissary east to find potential wives. In Oregon, for example, bachelors in the Willamette Valley collected funds to pay two brothers to travel east, post brides wanted notices, and recruit women willing to relocate west in exchange for free passage and the promise of eligible husbands. More than 100 women ultimately joined that migration back to Oregon. Farther north, the young city of Seattle faced a similar shortage. In the 1860s, a local man named Asa Mercer organized 2 expeditions to bring women from New England to Washington Territory. Most were recruited as teachers, but everyone understood that in a place where 9 out of 10 adults were men, marriage would not be far behind. His first voyage in 1864 delivered 11 young women. A second trip a couple of years later brought several dozen more. Most of these Mercer Girls, as newspapers and later television writers called them, married within a short time of arriving in Puget Sound. Whether arranged by an ambitious promoter or by a small advertisement in a local paper, these journeys all worked the same way in the end. At some point, a woman had to stand in a crowded, smoky train station or on a windy wharf, holding a carpet bag and a letter, and look for a man she knew only from a photograph and a patchwork of sentences. Historians who write about mail-order brides on the 19th-century American frontier emphasize 2 points that sit together in tension. The first is that many of these marriages were, by the standards of the time, genuine and successful. Memoirs, oral histories, and family stories describe couples who built homesteads together for decades. Some of the women became partners in ranches and stores, co-running boarding houses, small hotels, or farms. Others became teachers, midwives, or pillars of church congregations, helping to turn what had been rough camps into settled towns. The second point is that the risks were enormous, and they fell overwhelmingly on the women. While there were marriage bureaus and matchmakers who tried to screen suitors, the tools were crude. Newspaper editors might reject obviously dishonest ads, and a few agencies kept files of letters and references, but there was no way to verify a stranger's claims about his drinking habits, temper, or financial situation from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Researchers who have followed these paper trails find plenty of cases where the man at the depot was older, poorer, or harsher than his letters had suggested. Some agencies and individuals went further, running outright scams, collecting fees from hopeful men and women, and then vanishing or intentionally misrepresenting candidates on both sides. 19th-century newspapers and later historians both document such frauds. For all that, the system endured because, for a large number of people on both sides, it worked well enough. Imagine a woman in the 1870s living in a row house in a crowded eastern city. She works long hours in a laundry or factory, comes home to a cramped room she shares with relatives or other women, and has little hope of changing her situation. Her prospects for marriage are diminishing as she ages past her early 20s with no dowry and no influential family. Then she sees a notice in a newspaper at the reading room. Western farmer, age 32, of decent character and means, wishes to correspond with an intelligent lady of moral habits with view to matrimony. Address: this is not a fairy tale invitation, it is a gamble. But from her perspective, staying where she is also a gamble. The letters she begins trading with this man are practical as well as hopeful. They talk about religion. He's a Methodist. She was raised Baptist. They discuss children. He wants them. She does too. He describes the winters, harsh but beautiful. She describes her willingness to work in the fields if necessary, to cook, to sew, to keep house. They are, in their way, interviewing each other. Historians of the period note that these women were often strikingly clear-eyed about what they were doing. Many of them were poor but literate, reading newspapers and serialized novels, well aware of the dangers, but feeling that the risk of inaction might be greater than the risk of boarding a train. At some point, the correspondence shifts. The letters grow slightly more personal. He sends a photograph, stiff, formal, taken by a local photographer, his hand resting on a book to suggest education or on a chair to suggest stability. She sends one back, having sat for a photographer herself, wearing her best dress, trying to look older or younger or simply respectable. They do not fall in love in the way a modern romantic comedy might demand, but they do come to feel that they know each other, at least a little. Enough, perhaps, to take the next step. He wires money for the ticket. The journey itself could take days or weeks. From an East Coast city, she might travel by train through Chicago and Omaha, then farther west to Cheyenne or Denver. From there, perhaps a stagecoach or wagon to a smaller town. For women joining the Mercer expeditions to the Pacific Northwest, the journey involved ships, long sea passages around Cape Horn or through the Isthmus of Panama, then transfer to smaller vessels, and finally, arrival in a place with muddy streets and fresh tree stumps where streets ought to be. On the train, she might sit with other women making similar journeys, some headed to relatives, some to new jobs, some also planning to marry men they knew only through paper. They shared fears in low voices. What if he is cruel? What if he lied? What if he never appears at the station and she is left alone in a place where she knows no one? For many of the men waiting on the other side, the anxiety was just as sharp. They had sent whatever savings they could spare for a ticket. They had cleaned their cabins or rented a better room in town, bought or borrowed presentable clothes, imagined again and again how that first meeting would go. They worried that she would take one look at them and decide to get back on the train. They worried that she would not come at all. Some brought friends for moral support. A few communities made it a public occasion, especially when women arrived in groups, with local dignitaries giving speeches or holding small receptions at churches or schoolhouses, keen to show that these were respectable arrangements, not thin disguises for trafficking or vice. And then, finally, the moment. The screech of brakes, the shout of the conductor, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal, the hiss of steam. Passengers spill onto the platform, blinking in the sunlight. Men scan faces, looking for the tilt of a chin, the shape of a mouth they've only seen on a stiff photograph. Women look for the hat, the jacket, the awkward shuffle that matches the descriptions in the letters. Sometimes, according to later recollections, they recognized each other immediately, almost eerily, as though the distance between the words on the page and the bodies in front of them had been shorter than the miles would suggest. Other times, the shock was obvious. A man might look 20 years older than his photograph, or worn down by hard work and illness. A woman might be plainer than he had imagined, or more serious, or carrying a child from a previous marriage he hadn't fully understood. In a few dramatic cases recorded in letters and local gossip, a woman turned around and refused to go through with it, choosing to seek work in town or return east rather than marry the man who had met her. More often, though, they did what they had planned to do. They shook hands, exchanged halting remarks, and walked together to the nearest justice of the peace or church. A marriage performed an hour after stepping off a train looks shocking to modern eyes. To them, it looked like closure on a decision they had both already made. For the women who went through with these arrangements, married life on the frontier could be anything from quietly content to brutally hard. On the positive side, the math of the frontier often worked in their favor. With far more men than women in many areas, husbands had strong incentives to keep their wives reasonably content. A woman who was badly mistreated sometimes had the option of leaving and finding work or another partner elsewhere. options that might have been socially impossible in her home community back east. Some women found more autonomy than they had ever expected to have. They helped run ranches, kept books, managed small businesses. The wives who came west with Asa Mercer, for example, were often educated and worked as teachers, gaining public roles in their communities. One, Elizabeth Ordway, never married at all, instead devoting her life to education and campaigning for women's suffrage in Washington Territory. Yet the constraints were very real. Housework on the frontier was not a soft option. Women hauled water, chopped wood, made soap, cooked for laborers, sewed and repaired clothing, nursed the sick, and bore children with little medical help. Modern research on historical gender norms notes that isolation from extended family, lack of infrastructure, and the demands of childcare tended to trap many frontier women firmly in the domestic sphere, even when they might have been capable of more public roles. If a mail-order marriage turned sour, the woman's choices were limited. Divorce was legally possible in many territories and states, and by the late 19th century, a few Western and Midwestern places gained a reputation as divorce mills, with shorter residency requirements and more flexible grounds than elsewhere. But for most frontier women, the social cost was still substantial, particularly for those with children. Some endured unhappy or abusive marriages because they felt they had no safe alternative, especially in isolated rural areas. Others left quietly, taking work in boarding houses, hotels, or other towns, sometimes disappearing from the record altogether. At the same time, it would be wrong to imagine these women purely as victims of a system. For many, entering into a long-distance marriage was an act of agency, however constrained. They weighed their options, chose a path, and accepted the dangers knowingly. And they changed the frontier. Where there had been rough all-male camps, the arrival of women, by marriage, by teaching contracts, by church work, helped shift places toward permanence. Cabins gained curtains and gardens, saloons had to compete with churches and schools for influence. Towns invested in better roads and public buildings. The birth of children anchored families to particular patches of land. Scholars who study gender and the frontier argue that even as women were often locked into domestic roles, their presence was essential in turning temporary extraction camps into enduring communities. In many families, the mail-order courtship became a cherished origin story, told to children and grandchildren. How grandmother boarded a train with only a trunk and a Bible. How grandfather paced the platform, sweating through his best shirt. How a thin envelope of letters and a couple of photographs became the foundation of an entire clan in the West. The practice also connected the American frontier to broader patterns around the world. In the early 20th century, as immigration laws tightened, picture bride systems emerged linking Japanese, Korean, and other women to male laborers in Hawaii and on the U.S. mainland. These marriages, arranged through photos and letters, often involved mass wedding ceremonies on the docks when ships arrived. Many of the women found conditions harsher than promised, and they too faced discrimination, abuse, and limited options. Across time and place, the themes repeat: skewed sex ratios, economic hardship, the promise of a better life somewhere else, and the dangerous hope that a stranger on the other end of a letter might be kind. Today, the phrase mail-order bride is loaded, often used as a punchline or a criticism. Modern international marriage agencies, and many of the women involved in them, reject the term as stigmatizing. But the story of the 19th century frontier brides is not a joke, and it is not simple. It is the story of thousands of individual choices made by women and men navigating narrow paths through poverty, loneliness, and social expectation. It is the story of how a young country filled its empty spaces and built families in places where, at first, there had been only tents and shacks and the ringing of hammers. On some quiet night in the 1880s, in a cabin lit by a single lamp, a woman might have opened a small box where she kept the keepsakes from that time. A bundle of letters tied with worn ribbon, the first photograph he sent, Perhaps a train ticket kept as a reminder of the journey that changed everything. She might have listened to the creak of the house around her, the muffled breathing of children asleep in the next room, the faint sounds of a town that would not have existed without people like her. And she might have thought, just for a moment, of the night she wrote her first letter to a stranger far away and of the courage it took to sign her name. She married a stranger by mail. The stranger became a husband, the husband a partner, the partner an old man dozing by the stove. The thin paper became a life, laid down day after day like planks in a floor, sturdy enough for generations to walk on. That is the true story of frontier brides. Not a fantasy, not a tragedy, but something harder and more human. A long gamble played in ink and iron rails, in hope and hard work, under the wide, indifferent sky of the American West.